The check arrived at 11:47 p.m., placed gently at the edge of the table, as if even the waiter sensed the hour had grown fragile. Paul Newman glanced down at the small rectangle of paper, then across the table at Robert Redford, who was mid-sentence, still laughing at a story that had already been told a dozen times over the years. Something in Newman stilled. Not dramatic, not visible, just a quiet pause that lived somewhere behind his eyes. The restaurant had thinned to a low murmur, glassware clinking in distant intervals, the warm light settling into the kind of softness that belongs only to late evenings and long friendships. He folded his napkin with deliberate care, smoothing its edges as though time itself could be pressed flat. Had you ever sat across from someone and felt the strange awareness that a moment was passing into memory even before it ended? Redford didn't notice the silence that lingered half a breath longer than usual. Newman did, and he let the silence stay. The invitation had come days earlier, delivered in the most ordinary way imaginable. Newman's voice on the phone was steady, familiar, carrying the relaxed rhythm of a man suggesting something routine. He said he hadn't seen him in a while. He said they should have dinner. No urgency, no weight, no hint that the calendar had suddenly acquired edges. Redford said yes the way he always did, without ceremony, as if time rearranged itself whenever Newman called. What he heard was an old friend reaching out. What he could not hear was the silence surrounding the words. By then, Newman already knew. The diagnosis had arrived quietly, clinical language wrapped around an irreversible truth, and he had absorbed it with the private stubbornness that had defined him for decades. He told almost no one, not because he was in denial, but because he understood something most people discover too late. News like this does not belong only to the person who receives it. It spreads, it alters rooms, it changes the way people look at you. So he chose normal. He chose an ordinary dinner, an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary invitation that carried none of the gravity he was holding alone. And here is the question that lingers. Was silence his way of protecting his friend, or his way of protecting one last evening from becoming something else entirely? He had asked for the corner booth, a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know him well. From that seat, the room opened in quiet layers, the entrance door, the bar's amber glow, the slow choreography of waiters moving between tables. It was a place for watching without being watched, for holding a private world inside a public space. They had sat there before, years earlier, when success felt new and the future felt endless. Back then, the laughter had been louder, the debates sharper, the hours less counted. Memory does that. It folds time so the decades collapse into a single shared glance. Now, the same table held two men who had lived entire lives in the space between those earlier dinners and this one. The wood was polished smoother, the light softer, the air filled with the low murmur of strangers whose lives would never intersect with theirs again. Newman's choice was not accidental. When you know a chapter is closing, you instinctively return to the vantage points where the story once felt open. From the corner he could see everything, the movement of the room, the passage of moments, the friend across from him framed by years of shared history. And perhaps he was measuring the distance between then and now, between who they had been and who remained, holding both in the same quiet view.
They spoke the way people do when nothing needs to be proven and nothing needs to be performed. The conversation moved in easy circles, one story leading to another, jokes landing without effort, the rhythm of familiarity carrying them forward. They teased each other about age in the same tone they had used decades earlier, a language built from years of shared work and quiet loyalty. Redford talked about the conservation battles that still occupied his days, land that needed defending, causes that refused to become easier with time. Newman listened with the full attention of a man who had always cared more about purpose than applause. They drifted to family, to daughters and grandchildren, to the strange experience of watching younger generations move through a world so different from the one they had inherited. Pride appeared in small flashes, understated but unmistakable. They argued briefly about a director they had both known. A friendly disagreement carried more by enjoyment than conviction, the kind of debate that exists purely for the pleasure of the exchange. Underneath it all ran the steady current of shared history, a sense that each sentence rested on decades of unspoken understanding. Have you ever noticed how real friendship requires so little explanation? The pauses were comfortable, the laughter unforced, the memories arriving without effort. Everything felt ordinary, almost routine, and yet within that routine lived the quiet dignity of two men measuring their lives not in accolades, but in the work they had done and the bond that had endured beyond it. At some point, the rhythm shifted, so gently it might have been missed if you weren't listening for the spaces between words. Newman lingered longer before responding, letting memories settle instead of moving past them. He asked about moments from years back, small fragments most people would have forgotten, as if he were turning stones over to see what still lived beneath them. Then, without preface, he asked Redford to tell him something he had never said before. The request hung there, unexpected, almost out of character, and the air between them grew quieter. Why ask that now, after decades of shared history? Redford hesitated, searching through a lifetime of experience, and finally offered a story from early in his career, a moment when he had nearly walked away from everything. Newman listened without interruption, absorbing it with a stillness that felt deeper than attention. When Redford finished, Newman admitted there had been a year when he too had almost quit, something he had never spoken aloud. The confession was simple, nearly weightless in tone, yet it altered the space between them. In that exchange lived a rare kind of intimacy, the kind that appears not in grand revelations, but in truths released without defense. And beneath the calm surface lingered a quiet question neither man voiced. When you begin revisiting the roads not taken, are you remembering the past or preparing to release it? Outside, the night held the lingering warmth of late summer, that gentle in-between hour when the air feels suspended and time seems willing to pause. They stood beside the curb for a moment, hands in pockets, neither hurrying the goodbye nor stretching it into something theatrical. Redford adjusted his jacket and said it had been a good dinner, the kind of simple verdict offered after an evening that asked nothing and delivered comfort. Newman agreed with a small nod, as if the words carried more meaning than either of them chose to unpack. They stepped forward and embraced, the brief, firm contact of men shaped by a generation that favored restraint over display. And yet Newman held on a fraction longer than habit required, not enough to invite comment, only enough to register somewhere below conscious notice. Have you ever felt a farewell hesitate, as if something inside it were trying to speak? Redford stepped back, offered a final wave, and turned toward his car with the ease of someone certain there would be another dinner, another conversation waiting somewhere ahead. Newman remained where he was, watching until the taillights merged with traffic and disappeared. Only then did he turn back toward the quiet restaurant, committing the doorway, the window light, and the empty booth to memory, the way we hold on to ordinary images when some deeper part of us understands they are the last. 23 days later, the news moved through the world with a quiet heaviness. Paul Newman was gone. The headlines were respectful, the tributes immediate, yet the finality of the words landed differently for those who had shared a table with him only weeks before. Robert Redford learned the truth the way the rest of the world did, through the public announcement, a simple statement that carried an absence no sentence could soften. Only afterward did he begin replaying the dinner in his mind, the deliberate folding of the napkin, the attentive pauses, the unexpected questions, the extra second in the embrace. At first, they had seemed like nothing more than gestures of age and familiarity. Now they rearranged themselves into something else entirely. Joanne later told him about the diagnosis, about the decision to say nothing, about the intention to protect one last evening from sorrow. And in that moment, memory shifted. What had felt ordinary became intentional. What had seemed casual revealed careful design. Have you ever realized too late that a moment you lived inside was already a farewell? The wine, the laughter, the quiet sidewalk parting, all of it returned not as loss alone, but as a final gift, an evening shaped by love and understood only in its absence. There is a version of love that announces itself loudly, that gathers witnesses and leaves behind speeches, declarations, and visible grief. And then there is the quieter form, the one that moves without ceremony and leaves its meaning hidden inside ordinary moments. What Newman offered that night was not a dramatic farewell, but protection. He chose to shield his friend from anticipatory sorrow, to preserve one last evening untouched by the weight of what was coming. In doing so, he transformed something simple into something enduring. The meal was unremarkable, the conversation familiar, the goodbye restrained, yet within that simplicity lived a profound loyalty. How often do we overlook the gentle ways people care for us, mistaking them for routine instead of intention? The truth is that most of life is not shaped by grand gestures, but by quiet decisions made out of love. An ordinary dinner can become a final gift. A brief embrace can hold gratitude too deep for words. And a night that seemed like nothing special can become the memory that steadies you for years. If this story stirs someone in your own life, consider what remains unsaid, what small moment might still be given while there is time. Sometimes the greatest kindness is not in saying goodbye, but in allowing everything, for one more evening, to feel perfectly fine.